Hey guys, sorry about the delay. Tried to go live from my phone and I somehow it created a whole new link and it wasn't working at all how I thought it was going to work. So here I am. I was trying to do it like keep the setup raw like I've been doing for the previous ones, but it ended up just creating more of a problem. The last couple episodes I've gone live on Instagram and then I would just upload to YouTube and Facebook after that. So I'd figured, well, I have a couple subscribers now, so I will, I figured I would just go live over here. And so far, I don't see anyone here, so it sounds like I'm talking to myself. Um, let's see. I don't even know if this is okay. It's working. If anyone's here, can you let me know in the chat if you're here? S- And I apologize for everything. Okay, we have somebody here. All right, perfect. Okay, so I don't know. I'm going to try to do, this is kind of a test run too. So I apologize. So just bear with me here for some of this stuff because my audio, I don't know if you're going to be able to hear the audio with this format. So I think what I need to do is just share my screen and then play the audio that way. Let me see. On February 6th. Okay. So, yeah, when I share my screen, we'll see if you guys can hear. Anyway, welcome back, guys. So, I will go ahead and just do this like we usually do it, and I will see if you guys can hear this, and we'll just troubleshoot it. Anyway, let's just jump right in here. So, I have the chat up there. Let me pull up my notes. Why can't I see my notes now? Oh, I have to escape that. All right, so welcome back to my book club, if that's what we want to call it. We've been covering this book Genesis for the Space Race by John B. Leith. I'm going to get into three more chapters of this book. This is going to be another three-part series. And actually, today we're starting with technically part two, because part two is a meaty part of the story. So we're going to get into Operation Highjump, which many people have heard of, and it's kind of an old, tired story by now. But this book, it contains so much incredible information about that operation that I have never heard. And it was much more involved, and they actually flew into the planet. It wasn't that they just went to the South Pole and Antarctica and were encountered by flying saucers with swastikas on them. They actually took a whole squadron into the hole, into the inner Earth city, New Germany, which we've talked about in the previous episodes. So it's a whole other story, and it's amazing what happened. And that's what we're going to get into today in part two. And if you haven't saw the previous series on the Men from Atlantis, that is all technically a prequel to this. And basically, it was just showing how Germany made their way into Hollow Earth in the 1500s and established basically a civilization, a colony, a city there called New Germany and New Berlin during and post World War II. And it's a whole fascinating story. So now we're going to get into Admiral Byrd's expeditions to the North and South Pole and the U.S. basically um, trying to figure out. It was like a reconnaissance mission. So actually, the part that's going to be the third part of this series is actually going to entail a 1946 reconnaissance mission to map out the hole at the South Pole and determine an optimal route for Operation High Jump. So sorry if I'm jumping around because it gets a little confusing. So today we're going to get into Operation High Jump. Then the next part is going to it's going to entail a peaceful return visit in April 1947. But we return with our flying saucer, or what they call the round wing planes, which are 60 foot in diameter. So we allegedly had our own round wing plane program, a flying saucer program since 1936. Even though Germany simultaneously was developing theirs, the US was secretly doing something as well. And they decided to not read Byrd, Admiral Byrd in on that flying saucer program because if he had gotten captured by the Germans during Operation Highjump, then he didn't want it was plausible deniability. They didn't want him to have that information so it wouldn't be disclosed to the Germans because they were trying to keep that secret from the Germans. But they decided after Operation Highjump that they would go back with their flying saucers to basically show like assert I don't know, dominance, but just show the Germans that we in fact do have the technology that they have, and they're not the only ones. So that's what the next part we'll get into. But part one, part three, the prequel to this, we'll get into the reconnaissance mission down to the South Pole to map out the entrance and an optimal route for Operation High Jump. Um, these live streams are making me thirsty, Aaron says. That's Aaron in the chat, by the way, looks like. Craig's here. Hey, Craig, how's it going? Yeah, so this is a very fascinating history. And, Admiral Byrd, there's a whole history there. And, he's made many trips to the poles doing work for our military, determining whether or not there are entrances and what was up there. And there's a whole alleged missing diary where he did, in fact, encounter a advanced civilization prior to Operation High Jump, years before, and in the this was the North Pole, and he encountered an advanced civilization with flying saucers that spoke German. And they had a German dialect, and he came back and told our military about it and told our government, and they told him to never talk about it again. So he already had awareness of this, and that's why he was opted in for, that's why they needed him for Operation High Jump. And yeah, there's a whole interesting history. A lot of people say that diary has been debunked, but it hasn't been. In fact, there's a lot of information corroborating it. And Billy Woodard's testimony, who was an Air Force general who was fast-tracked to the military, one of the things he was tasked with doing while he was in the military was reading Admiral Byrd's diary, to which he said, I thought this was fake. And they said, no, it's real. But this is the real one, not the one you see floating around online, doesn't have all the details. So I'm going to go ahead and I think I'm gonna have to share my screen. This way you can actually hear the audio, uh, and we'll see how this goes. Let me pull this up. On February 6th. Oh, first of all, I'm gonna do an audio test. Tell me if you guys can hear this. On February 16th, 1947, Admiral Richard E. Byrd led his squadron of 8 propeller-driven Falcon bombers to the South Pole to. Can you guys hear that? Is that muffled? Is it quiet? Because this microphone's it's a directional microphone. It's not meant to pick up other sounds. So if you can hear that, then I'll roll with that. If not, I'll share my screen and share the audio. I'll just wait on you guys. But yeah, so we're going to get into the juicy details of Operation High Jump that we've never heard. I've never heard. Doesn't mean that everyone hasn't heard them, but it's new for me, and not many people have read this book. And it's one of those it's one of those sleepers, the Genesis for the space race. And basically, the book entails an entire history of how we eventually got into space, which a lot of people think is fake. But once you read this book, you'll know why they want people to think it's fake, because it's abundant and thriving with life. The planets are colonized. We have space stations up there. NASA's whole purpose is to basically put on a show, so we don't know what's actually up there. That's why they fake the moon footage like Artemis 2 and even the original landings, because in fact NASA doesn't even have jurisdiction in space. So they have to put on this show to make it seem like it's okay, guys, we have everything control in space, we know what's going on, we're the only people out there, so there's really nothing to worry about. And then they do this green screen Artemis 2 footage and all that stuff, but really there's much more involved with what's going on up there, and people think that we can't get through the Van Allen belt and whatever. But there's ways to what they call windows in and out of that, and if you have the right technology, you'll be able to pass through that easily. But if you're trying to pass through with a rocket, you're not going to have much luck. So okay, it sounds like you could hear that pretty good. Sounds like you could hear that pretty good. Okay. I'll go ahead and play this and we'll pause. If you're new to this, I'll just play this audiobook. It's from one of the chapters in the book, chapter 11, I believe, which is called Byrd, Stalks Missing Nazis, which I don't think is the greatest name for this chapter, but it's nonetheless, that's the name of it. And I'm just going to play the audio and pause along the way and comment. And so just put yourself back in 1947, post World War II. Imagine we've already done a reconnaissance mission in Antarctica to map out the diameter of the hole, the entrance to Hollow Earth, and then an optimal route to get there for Operation Highjump. Operation Highjump, we go back with a whole military squadron and to basically encounter the Germans. And there was a secret mission while the public was given, this science, they were told it was a science expedition, but really they were going down there to see what the Germans had actually set up. So I will go ahead and start playing this and then we'll see. And if there's any audio issues, please let me know.
On February 16, 1947, Admiral Richard E. Byrd led his squadron of 8 propeller-driven Falcon bombers to the South Pole to test German resistance. Each plane was powered by 4 Pratt & Whitney engines and tuned with precision for the endurance flight into the unknown interior of the Earth. The planes were fully armed, but orders from President Truman was that Byrd was not to fire on any German craft he met in the Hollow Earth. As the squadron repeated the flight pattern executed the year before, Byrd and his crew surveyed the terrain. Only this time, besides his own crew, a total of 60 astonished combat veteran Americans were descending in a straight southerly line towards the interior of a planet that was presumed to be of a solid molten core. They carefully noted that the mouth of the double funnel, or screw, as Byrd called it, had a 500-mile opening in the bottom of the Antarctic Valley that tapered down to a diameter of 125 miles. Through this opening, they would fly for 800 miles towards the interior.
So we were led to believe that Operation High Jump, they just flew to Antarctica and took ships there and Navy destroyers and the whole squadron. But we never heard, at least I've never heard the details that they actually flew 800 miles into the hole with a whole squadron of planes. And so this is new details for me. And I feel like it sounds a little echoey still. So I am going to share my screen and continue playing it that way. Just because share sound. I think it'll sound better for everyone. And then I will continue playing this way.
Before emerging again in a vortex-like aperture inside the Earth. Gradually, the bottom of the hole to the interior widened as it did at the top side, until the squadron of Falcons found themselves entering into a hollow world within a world. Above the planes, the crew saw what appeared to be sky and clouds. Below was sea and land just as above. They were now in the interior of the hollow Earth, which Byrd in 1929 had described as that enchanted continent in the sky, a land of everlasting mystery. Whereas on the outer surface of the planet, a direct line of vision on the convex surface is 7 miles. A straight visual sighting on the surface of the Earth's interior would be ad infinitum, except for air impurities. Compasses on the aircraft, strangely enough, returned to normal upon their entrance to the interior of the Earth. They were now descending further inside the Earth's sphere, flying in an atmosphere identical to that on the outside of the planet. The seas and land masses clung to the interior walls, and the void between was filled with clouds and light, in which there were seen mirages of the sea and terrain below. As the outside Earthlings sped on at 259 miles per hour, every sight they beheld triggered new stimuli of curiosity. They were not flying into a molten mass, and the only heat and light energy source came from a diminutive misty ball of fire, an interior sun that seemed to hang suspended in front of them in the center of the globe's interior.
So they flew through this hole 800 miles and they're discovering this vast new landscape with continents, oceans, mountains, clouds, another sun, and they're just in awe by this. And we're supposed to have believed that it was a molten core, and in fact, in a different part of this book, they explain how the molten core story theory, it makes sense for when the planet was forming, but it's no longer forming anymore. So it's nothing like what we've been told and what we think, and it's in fact hollow. But then they say, so there's a hollow Earth with continents and land masses and everything and its own sun on the inside. But then within the Earth's crust, there's a whole honeycombed network of cities as well, which they call the Agartha network, or there's other names for it, which they say that there's more people living within the Earth's crust than on either surface. So if you imagine that, so take the Earth's population on the surface, basically double that for the interior for hollow Earth, and then add more to that for the crust of the Earth. We're talking, we have no idea how many beings are actually inhabiting this planet.
The land masses below were protrusions on the inside of the Earth's 800 to 1,200 mile thick mantle. The flyers observed one major difference from the outside of their planet. The interior appeared to have a greater land surface, for as they continued south, their visions widened in this new concave world surrounding them. There were no celestial bearings, no pole star or planet Venus on which to take a dead reckoning. Each hoped their squadron could find its way out. In this unbelievable world of fantasy, Admiral Richard E. Byrd, commanding 8 Navy Falcons and 60 airmen, went stalking Germans. A bellicose nation from the Earth's surface had broken into the interior in search of another Aryan race, with whom they had fought 2 world wars in the present century. Was the enemy here in this lair, and would he fight? Byrd had taken his squadron further than he himself had ventured the year before. He was now recording a distance of over 2,400 air miles from base. Still flying north at approximately 10,000 feet, Byrd's navigator, Captain Ben Miller of Navy Air Arm, spotted what appeared to be an airfield. Only hours before Captain Miller had joined Byrd's crew, he had temporarily turned over to his second-in-command the command of his carrier from which the flight departed when Byrd's original navigator had taken ill at the last moment. All eyes of the American squadron peered down and confirmed the sighting. A closer scrutiny revealed various fixed-wing aircraft lined up in rows, and high-powered lenses picked out their identity markings. Swastikas, the emblems of Nazi Germany, were clearly visible. The American squadron flew on. They reached a point of 2,700 miles within the Earth before the order was given by Byrd to return. The cameras on Byrd's plane whirred away as a pictorial account of his journey was made. An
So they are now discovering that, they found what they were there to find, what they were looking for, and they're seeing evidence of a German civilization deep within our planet. And this is where we're at now. But it's talking about the pictures. So in the early expeditions, there were hundreds of photos that were taken of the interior of the planet and the German civilization. And then even the follow-up mission after this in April of 1947, they come back and they take even more pictures. But this time it seems to be that they're filming 360 degrees like the entire time. So as the plane flies, it just films everything. And it's a fascinating story. But anyway, so now they are coming up on the German civilization.
The cameras on Byrd's plane whirred away as a pictorial account of his journey was made. An hour later, the planes returned over the same compass bearing. Down below, they had seen rows of buildings on their trip north and endless plains at a particular bearing. Now these were gone. The pictures developed by National Defense later showed the airport had been quickly camouflaged. Suddenly, the Falcon pilots observed that they had uninvited company. Above them and behind on their tails were 5 unmarked round-wing planes, which the Germans had finally elected to expose. Byrd had come to this new German world poorly prepared for decisions on the conduct of aerial confrontation. He was primarily an explorer. The Joint Chiefs of Staff had assessed his capabilities, and at the last-minute briefing, Byrd was ordered not to fire on any Germans if he encountered them in flight. Those instructions exist today and were explicit. In addition, Byrd did not evaluate his squadron's vulnerability in the present air strategy, which the 5 round-wing planes controlled. And worse, he regarded the German-piloted round-wing planes as his natural enemy with whom there could be no compromise. Yet, Byrd was not a combat admiral, and suddenly he was catapulted into making a decision whether to accept or decline aerial combat. Did he fail at that time to discern that his enemy, so-called, had abandoned the propeller or even jet-powered aircraft of World War II vintage. Certainly Byrd was cognizant from his experience the year before that the Germans now rode the sky in advanced design aircraft that made his conventional Falcon aircraft completely outmoded. But on the other hand, giving Admiral Byrd the benefit of the doubt, did he purposely intend to confront the Germans and make them show their hand? No one knows what illogical drive motivated him in his last-moment decisions, but they were not the result of any wise on-the-spot military sagacity or desire for survival. The only thing that can be said on behalf of Byrd is that the round-wing planes were conundrums that in his mind produced a panic. Byrd had already given orders to his own gunners to be prepared to fire, and his co-pilot reminded him the order should be rescinded. Therefore, all of his aircraft were in a state of combat readiness. Perhaps 10 seconds remained in which the Admiral could have changed his mind. Then Byrd received an unexpected message on his wavelength from outside his aircraft. Admiral Byrd, this is General Kurt von Ludwig, commander of the flying ships you see above. Our firepower has your squadron covered. The same German commander who was interviewed to substantiate this episode continued. World War II is over. Leave us alone and return to your base. However, if you wish to land at our station in peace, we shall receive you Americans in peace, for you are not our enemies. Our aircraft and weapons are so superior to yours that I advise you not to fire on us. There is no chance for your squadron to survive our attack if you insist on fighting. I would also remind you that you are over territory controlled by New Germany and that you are here under our sufferance. Commander Byrd listened but did not reply. When the German had finished speaking, Byrd gave his order in 2 words: open fire.
All right, I'll pause it right there for a second. Why he decided to open fire after he had just received a message saying, "We come in peace, you'll be accepted in peace," and invited them to land. Byrd was given direct orders not to fire in the briefing, in the meeting before the mission. So why he went against orders and fired, who knows? But it's a wild story what happens next.
His aircraft hardly had time to comply before the sky seemed to explode. Those Falcons hit by the saucer's laser beams broke up and spiraled or nosedived to Earth, where the crews were killed on impact. From what looked like hidden anti-aircraft gun sights on the land below, there emanated pencil-thin broken beams of red light. An American witness in one of the planes struck with this ray weapon said, "The ray seemed to let us down gradually, and our pilot was helpless to maintain control. We had to ditch. Those who could bailed out." Admiral Byrd watched his entire supporting aircraft plummeting out of the sky nearby. Suddenly, the voice of the German commander broke into his wavelength again. "Commander Byrd, you are a fool. You have sacrificed your own men. You were warned. Now leave this land and never return. Leave at once." Byrd was shaken and quickly went into shock. Miller took over the controls and pointed the aircraft for the opening that led to the top side of the world. Byrd had carried out his orders to find the Germans. He had entered the young lion's den, but he was no Daniel. The scene that followed as the American planes crashed to Earth was not reminiscent of a wartime landing in hostile enemy territory. American survivors picked up by the Germans were interviewed in 1977.
Okay, so what happened was, just to recap, the Byrd ordered them to fire. Before they could even fire, they were shot down by the Germans' weapons, which were red laser beams, shot down by laser weapons. Byrd went into some form of shock. His co-pilot had to take over, and they came over to air comms and they said, "You're a fool for doing this. Leave now." So Byrd is on his way out. His co-pilot is flying him back out towards the entrance, but now the planes that were shot down have crashed, and instead of being held hostage, we're about to hear how the Germans actually treated the Americans that survived.
To verify the German version of what took place, the Germans immediately mounted an all-out rescue attempt in order to save the American airmen. Some of the crashed American planes were not severely disabled. From these, the occupants quickly crawled out with their hands over their heads. They were met by Germans who immediately disarmed them and asked them to drop their hands, saying that they were in friendly territory. German crews hurriedly raced to the totally demolished American planes, extinguished fires, and removed bodies in an attempt to save lives. 26 live Americans were finally assembled that day by the Germans as ambulances with doctors sped to the scene. Paramedics administered first aid to the surviving American crew members as the ambulances headed to nearby hospitals in New Berlin. At the hospital, German specialists set limbs and carefully stitched wounds and made the Americans as comfortable as possible. Occasionally, the Germans addressed the Americans in English, some quietly telling how they had taken their degrees at German and American institutions. Crew members not severely injured were taken into the city. A sign on the outskirts said, "New Berlin." The prisoners were then given an escorted automobile tour of the emerging city, which the Germans had secretly begun in early 1940. Examples of buildings designed by Albert Speer on the order of Adolf Hitler were shown to the visitors. Stunned by the cautious friendliness of the Germans, the Americans were given a meal and made comfortable in a hotel. But not all the invading Americans were so fortunate. As Byrd's plane sped homeward to his carrier base, German morticians embalmed and dressed the young Americans killed in the New Berlin raid. Using ID cards, victims were identified, features restored when necessary, and then redressed in their own flight suits. The remains were placed in sealed plastic coffins. The German commander came in and met some of the surviving American officers. Introducing himself, he called them heroic fools.
So this is really interesting to me. They they say they refer to this, the Germans refer to it as a raid on New Berlin. So we call it Operation Highjump, they call it a raid on New Berlin. So there's a whole other side of the story to this. And the only way the Germans were allowed access to into Inner Earth and actually develop a city was to sign a treaty where they promised that there would be no war or violence, and they were being heavily monitored by the Inner Earth inhabitants already. So if they incited any violence, they would be basically ejected back to the surface world. So the Germans were very nice, and the Germans who had relocated there decided that they were no longer interested in war, and they wanted to live a peaceful life. So that's why the Americans were met with such peace, and they actually helped them recover. And then you're about to find out what happens next, which is so interesting.
The next day was February 17th, 1947. Open German army trucks had picked up the various bodies of the young Americans. The vehicles assembled and slowly the cortege bore the dead American airmen through the broad streets of the new city. At the convoy's head, a German military band played Mendelssohn's Funeral March. Behind the cortege, German airmen themselves, in honor, marched in slow step. Escorted in cars, American survivors brought up the rear. As the funeral procession moved toward the airfield, cannons were fired in the air, and all German flags on government buildings flew at half-mast as the dead and living Americans were prepared for their trip home. For the Americans and the Germans, it was the unofficial end of World War II combat. At the New Berlin airport, 5 saucers sat waiting. The dead Americans in unbreakable plastic coffins were placed on board another craft. The 24 walking cases were taken on board 2 other German craft. Finally, Commander Kurt von Ludwig and his crew boarded the lead ship. A squadron of 5 German UFOs rose silently and headed south to the hole at the end of the world to pay a regretful respect to 60 living and dead Americans. Emerging from the South Pole funnel, the saucers took a northerly course from the Antarctic continent towards Australia. Approximately 1,800 miles southwest of Sydney, Australia, a U.S. aircraft carrier hove to at the radio request of the German commander.
Okay, so they've taken all the dead bodies in coffins, and then the remaining survivors, they're in a squadron of 5 German flying saucers. They've gone out through the South Pole and Antarctica, and they're heading towards Australia to a Navy aircraft carrier where they are going to basically deliver the survivors.
As Fleet Commander Rear Admiral Cruzen listened, Flat Top Commander Ben Miller, now back in control of his own ship, was hooked into the radio of the German round-wing plane. A friend of Commander Miller then spoke from the German craft. The American survivor appealed to the commanding officer to allow the Germans to land on one end of the carrier flight deck to deliver American survivors.
So this is important to understand in case you missed that. They let one of the American survivors come over the intercom, over the airwaves, and say, basically, let us land. You know, if it was one of the German officers, obviously it could have gone a lot differently. So he talked to the admiral aboard the aircraft carrier, and basically they got permission to land.
The German UFOs sat down as Commander Kurt von Ludwig hovered above in an attitude of surveillance. Americans stood down. No guns were drawn, no orders were given, no battle positions were taken. The walking Americans stepped out and then moved to the other German round-wing planes to remove the wounded. These were placed or helped on deck. American sailors began to stand at attention, and many officers stood at silent salute. No American word had been spoken. No German voice had been heard. When the last stretcher was removed, the German UFOs silently lifted and joined their commander aloft. Then suddenly, they were gone. Under sedation in the carrier's sickbay, Admiral Byrd had missed the last chapter of the tragic drama he had begun. From below the carrier flight deck, an ambulance plane was hoisted. Within 20 minutes, it too was airborne, headed for Honolulu, Hawaii, where Pearl Harbor was alerted to receive the injured. The same night, over 10,000 miles away from the carrier, 5 round-wing planes appeared at 8 p.m. over Arlington, Virginia. They stopped in midair and hovered over the tomb of World War I's unknown soldier.
So they, the U.S. military now takes the survivors to Honolulu, Pearl Harbor. They go and I guess to receive the rest of their recovery and care. And then now the German flying saucers, the 5 other craft are now taking the dead bodies over to Virginia above a cemetery of the unknown soldier. So this is all details that I have never heard about Operation Highjump. This is far more involved than I ever understood or researched, and I don't believe this information is probably can be found anywhere else outside of this book, at least publicly, right? So I just find this all extremely fascinating. And they're going to even talk about this interesting, like ghost-like apparition soldier that the Germans witness when they're dropping off these bodies at this cemetery. This is apparently this is a true story because I looked into it. Allegedly, at this tomb of the unknown soldier, there are ghost stories. There's stories of paranormal activity, and especially in particular, this one soldier apparition that seems to appear, and there have been many witnesses.
A German plane broke formation and landed in an open area near the tomb. The door of the craft opened and darkened forms brought out the bodies of the 30 American airmen who had perished 2 days before. There is a spirit, believed to be that of the unknown soldier, which had appeared often in the past whenever a body lay in state under the Capitol Rotunda. It was seen by many at Kennedy's death. It appeared when the body of President Eisenhower lay in state, and also appeared on the death of President Hoover, Johnson, and other notable Americans. The night of February 12th, as the Germans placed the bodies of the dead airmen before the tomb of the unknown soldier, completing their task, they stepped back and surveyed the darkened scene for a moment before entering their airships. As they watched, the apparition of the dead doughboy of the American Expeditionary Force in World War I was suddenly seen again. It gave a brisk salute and then vanished. The Germans themselves swear this appearance took place. What arrangements were made with the next of kin is not known. Nevertheless, 30 men of all ranks were buried with full military honors at the cemetery. Today, in a nearby building, a bronze plaque reposes, inscribed with the names of the young heroes, and how they died in the center of the earth. The plaque will be erected in the year 2000 AD.
So that's interesting. So there's a plaque made up to honor their service and how they died in the center of the world. And it was allegedly supposed to be installed in the year 2000 because this was 1947 or 46. I'm sorry, 1946. So to me, this is all that is, I know for a fact that plaque probably never got installed and still not there because we have not gotten disclosure in any capacity as far as Hollow Earth goes. In fact, they're pushing for the exact opposite. They want you to believe that we're just on this flat plane, and that story. We all know that story. So there are allegedly 30 soldiers buried in Virginia at the cemetery for the unknown soldier to dedicate, the soldiers that lost their lives in Operation Highjump. And we'll just probably never know about that.
From Arlington Cemetery, 3 of the German saucers stopped above the Capitol building, and 2 hovered over the White House where the Trumans lived.
Okay, I'm going to rewind that for a second. So now they stop, they drop the soldiers off at the cemetery, and then now they go basically a show of force over some political sites.
D. From Arlington Cemetery, 3 of the German saucers stopped above the Capitol building, and 2 hovered over the White House where the Trumans lived. Simultaneously, all 5 shone powerful searchlights on the buildings below. The Washington military was alerted. Then the German commander spoke via the Air Force radio channel. He said, "This display of our strength is a warning. If we so wished, we could destroy both your White House and Capitol with deadly rays, and within 5 minutes both historic places would be only ashes. Send no more armed military expeditions below, unless America wants full-scale war," the German warned. "If it is war you seek, then we shall fight you. But as for New Germany, we prefer peace and the friendship of America." The voice finished by saying, "The real enemy of both our peoples is Russia." All night, the German saucers hovered over Washington. Little did they suspect the U.S. chose not to show any of its military strength from the arsenal of over 500 laser-equipped round-wing planes hidden across the land.
So allegedly, if that's a big statement, the U.S. had an arsenal of over 500 round-wing planes, flying saucers, that were basically being stored at certain military bases in the surrounding area, and they elected not to. They still elected not to disclose this technology to the Germans at this time while they hovered above these sites. I guess as like a display of power and a threat, and they're trying to convince us that our real enemy was Russia. You got to keep in mind this was 1946, so 19. I'm so confused on the year. 1946 or 47. I keep getting it confused. But anyway, um, this was a long time ago. This was a long time ago when potentially Russia was still a threat. And this was obviously also a precursor to the 1952 flyovers that happened again because we our military was probably not complying to the German orders, and they had to come once again in 1952 and say, "Listen, like you guys are gonna destroy yourselves. You're gonna start a colossal war if you don't stop and leave us alone." And that's why the next part 2 of this video is going to get into the follow-up mission, which was a peaceful approach the second time with our technology.
The German craft departed westward at 9 a.m. the next day in a burst of speed. In 1948, acting independently of the Americans or other nations, the Russians, who had watched the 1947 Byrd foray in the Antarctic from an Antarctic base, sent a fully armed wing of conventional combat aircraft to the Earth's interior at the north. The Russians, told of the Americans' 1947 reception by the Germans at the South Pole, but uncertain of the outcome, elected to penetrate the North Pole entrance from their bases. The Russian planes were computer clocked by Americans passing Point Barrow, Alaska heading due east. Canadian bases on 3 northerly locations kept the Russian planes spotted. The American base reported 102 planes. The Canadian checkpoints reported 97 planes. The Russians' first aerial encounter was with the Guardians of the North Pole entrance, descendants of the Vikings whom the Germans call the Old Race. The Russian planes at first were challenged by the Old Race, but were allowed to proceed when they claimed they were on a mission to New Germany in the southern hemisphere. The Russian wing, still intact, continued past the man-made orb of light at the equator of the Earth's interior and sped toward the southern hemisphere where, in the Germans' lion's den, 7 UFOs were now waiting. No Russian enemy plane escaped German wrath. 100 planes and their crews perished. Those Russian bodies recovered were cremated. In 4.5 hours, German UFOs were over Moscow, brazenly scattering the ashes of the Russian dead over the capital. As in the Washington incident, the Germans broke into the military airwaves and taunted the Russians with the statement, "Here are the remains of your brave airmen you sent down to destroy us." Moscow's red alert sounded, and up into the skies to teach the invading Germans a lesson went Russian MiG fighters. One after another, the German machines easily disposed of all the Russian interceptors. In defiance, the German commander and his undamaged round-wing plane hovered imperially above. Then over the military frequencies that moments before cracked with Russian chatter of aerial combat, there came a final German voice. "Next time, we will annihilate you." The Germans flew off, intact. They would taunt the Russians over Moscow year after that memorial victory. That day, when the squadron leader von Ludwig landed in New Berlin, he patted his plane and commented, "I shall name her Old Ironsides in honor of today's fight."
Okay, and that's it for this chapter. So let's recap that. After the Germans return the American soldiers to the surface and then the dead bodies to Virginia, they go back. Russia hears about this. Russia decides they want to go see what's happening. They decide to send a squadron of allegedly 102 planes through the North Pole entrance, where they encounter the Vikings, who the Germans call the Old Race. And the Vikings come up a lot in this book. Allegedly, they still have a civilization inside the planet. So they encounter the Vikings, and the Vikings let them pass whenever they say, "We're going to New Germany." Obviously, they have awareness of this and they knew how to get there. The Vikings let them pass. They fly through the planet past the central sun, the man-made artificial sun that is illuminating the inside of the planet, which we actually learn a lot more about that sun in part three. It's fascinating technology. They pass that up and they head towards the South Pole, where they're encountered by seven German flying saucers. The Germans don't give them the benefit of the doubt. They shoot them down because they already saw Russia as the direct enemy, and Russia's whole squadron is destroyed. No survivors. They take the remains of the pilots who were shot down and they burn them. They cremate them and they take them, but they fly back with their flying saucers with the ashes to Moscow, and then they shower the city of Moscow with the remains, with the ashes of the pilots that were destroyed. And they basically threaten Russia and say, "Try this again, and we will annihilate you." So the Germans were just displaying a show of force. The United States now understood the capacity of what was going on. Not only did Germany establish a colony inside the planet, New Germany and New Berlin, with permission, but they also had this crazy advanced technology. But little did the Germans know at this time that the U.S. was developing their own flying saucer program, which the Germans would learn about in the follow-up mission whenever they decide to go back in April of 19 of the same year. Let me pull that up. I'm getting that year so confused in my head right now. Mm-mm-mm. Mhm. 19, okay. 1946 was the reconnaissance mission. 1947, April of 47. So 1947 was high jump. Yeah, sorry about that. I get the years confused. So anyway, when they go back in 1947, they go back, the US goes back in one of their flying saucers and they come in peace and they are not shot down. But then they are warned, which we'll learn about in the next part, is that basically they said if you want proper permission to access or to visit the inner world, you have to go through the Icelandic government. So basically, Iceland, for some reason in Iceland, is where all the processing, all of the arrangements are made for any visitations to Hollow Earth or vice versa. For any visitors from inner Earth to the surface, they have to get an Icelandic passport or visa to uh, be on the surface. And this was back in the 40s. And we learned in the previous episodes that that's how that one man who was working in George Washington University as a professor, he was here on the surface with an Icelandic visa. And that's how a lot of the information that's in this book even got distributed, was because they interviewed this guy who was actually from inside the planet, and he shared what he could. So we're dealing with a whole history here. But part two of this is going to get into the reconnaissance, the 1946 reconnaissance mission. I'm sorry, the 1947. The reconnaissance mission is going to be in part three. The 1947 return visit is what part two is going to cover. And that's really interesting because it's a peace, they call it a peaceful invasion by the United States. So there's a whole lot more that happened than we were led to believe as far as Operation Highjump was concerned. And I'm sure there's a lot more that's happened since then that we may never know about. But thank God this book was written. I do believe it to be credible. I, there could be some misinformation in there as far as dates and locations and names of people because that's how the misinformation works. So we have to keep that in mind, take it all with a grain of salt. But there's really a story here that needs to be told. And I apologize for any of the technical difficulties today. Um, this is, I think I'm just going to keep going with this format from now on. This way I know it works. I know it sounds good and there will be no confusion and we can just jump straight in next time. So I was going to wait until we got back from our Hawaii trip to do this, but I was like, man, this is too fascinating. I want to put this out. So I hope you guys enjoyed this. I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. Let me pull up the studio so I can end the stream. Yes, so fascinating. Never heard this much detail either. Fascinating, very helpful the way you recap and explain. Thank you. I promise it'll get a little more polished and professional. I know it was kind of sloppy at first, so uh, I'll find I'll find it my way here. I'll find what works best, and we'll keep doing these because I can read these books all day long, but I'm like, well, I feel like I have a responsibility to do something with this information. I could read the book, but then what's the purpose of me just like sitting with all that information uh, if I have a platform where I can share it and relay it to people who might not read the book? So I appreciate you guys who are here today, all 24 of you. I couldn't do this without you. I appreciate all the love and support for the new channel. And I'm excited to jump into part two. And we'll see how that goes. I might even be able to do it sometime early next week before Hawaii. Because once I'm in Hawaii, it's going to be at least 2 weeks plus before I'm back on this channel. So, yeah, stay tuned for that. I'll let you guys know. I hope you enjoy this. Please like, subscribe, and share. And until next time, have a great day.